Let's get started. Thanks for joining, everyone. So, today's webinar, we're going to be talking about what state agencies learned and how they adapted in the COVID pandemic. There's multiple sides to this. We're going to be talking about, the administrative side, how kind of practices and procedures were forced to rapidly adapt to deal with that, shift to an online world, but also the kind of practice side, how training moved online and the kind of occupation, shifting demand to different occupations as well. What we're going to hear about today from our speakers is not just, reflections about the past, but also what stuck, how those innovations have carried through today and how our state officers and administrators are thinking about those changes as we start to deal with the next set of labor market challenges, AI transformations. Um, on a personal note, I think this is like a really interesting topic. COVID was when I, really started to get engaged in apprenticeship in the UK. It was when we really used apprenticeship as our kind of like big active labor market policy. We kind of threw money at employers to hire apprentices in the pandemic to try and keep people in work. And we also especially turned towards healthcare, apprenticeships in healthcare. I really kind of realized the value of that. So I'm going to introduce our great speakers in a minute. Just a little bit of housekeeping up front before I do. First of all, as usual, this is being recorded. We'll share the recording and the slides on our website afterwards, so no need to take notes. Um, Format wise, so we'll have a short presentation up front that's covering the research here, and then we're going to open up for a panel discussion. And then we'll have some time at the end for questions. So if you've got any questions, put them in the sidebar as we're going along, and we'll take a note of them and come back to them. Or you can keep them, save them to the end, and we'll pick them up. Cool. Last thing from me before we get into it, I want to introduce our great speakers. So first up, we've got Ryan Ruggiero with Mathematica. So Ryan's a researcher in the Employment and Education division. Ryan works on workforce development, registered apprenticeship, and human services programs. And before Mathematica, Ryan worked with the federal government and the Peace Corps in South Africa. Ryan's going to kick us off in a minute, taking us through the research brief there. And then just a quick introduction for our panel. They're going to be speaking later. They're going to, I'm going to keep this really brief as they're going to introduce themselves properly later, but really excited to hear from our speakers. So today we've got Tonya Neely. Tonya is the director of the Mississippi Apprenticeship Program. So Tonya oversees grant management, works across the state with apprenticeship employers, community colleges, workforce partners. Tonya's got a background, across workforce, economic development, higher education administration. We've also got Adele Burnes. Adele is the chief of the California Division of Apprenticeship Standards. Adele has spent her career in workforce development from a number of different angles, leading apprenticeship work in the community Bay Area Community College Consortium, working on the kind of non-profit side in Europe, and then now in the California state, heading up California's apprenticeship office. And then last but not least, we got Jeremy Parker. So Jeremy is a senior field representative with Apprenticeship Minnesota, where he's been since 2018. Jeremy has got nearly 30 years experience in the construction industry. He's worked across the whole, every different role. He's done field work, sales, workforce development. Before working in apprenticeship management, Jeremy spent about 10 years working on job training services out in the field. So lots of kind of hands-on experience for people looking to enter careers in construction. Cool. So really looking forward to hearing from that panel later. But first of all, Ryan's going to kick us off, talking us through the research of, what happened, how state administrations adapted through the pandemic. So Ryan, I'm going to pass over to you to kick us off.
Great. Thanks so much, Harry, for that introduction. And you can go to the next slide. So my name is Ryan Ruggiero, and I'm a researcher at Mathematica based in New Jersey. Before we get to our panel discussion, like Harry said, I'm going to share some key findings from a 2023 brief that I co-authored with my colleague Andrew Krantz. The brief is based on two virtual discussion groups with state apprenticeship administrators from 8 states, and 3 of those states are on our panel discussion today. This brief was part of the State Apprenticeship Systems Capacity Assessment Study funded by the U.S. Department of Labor. And the takeaways that I'll share today address several research questions about how the COVID-19 pandemic affected state apprenticeship systems, including how administrators supported programs, how training delivery changed, and how interest and industry focus shifted. Next slide. So, a key role of state apprenticeship administrators is to support programs, of course. And when the pandemic hit, administrators leveraged technology to pivot their work online, like many of us did. And they also used technology to streamline work processes and expand reach. So, before COVID, we heard from administrators that meetings, engagement events, technical assistance, and program reviews were largely held in person. And when the pandemic started, most administrators said their agencies moved online fairly easily, which was really good to hear, using virtual meeting and collaboration tools. Moving their work to a virtual environment allowed staff to convene partners really quickly without having to coordinate travel schedules and having people travel in person to one location. And this was particularly helpful in very large states. And I think the quote on this slide here really captures that sentiment. California, in particular, described their ability to hold virtual meetings for the first time during the pandemic as beneficial to their agency and, quote, transformative across the board. We heard from two administrators that online work helped streamline paper-heavy processes, which reduced their dependency on paper. And most administrators said that moving in-person program reviews to virtual or hybrid formats allowed oversight of apprenticeship programs to continue during the pandemic. However, not all states were on board with virtual program reviews. 2 states said that they either continued with in-person program reviews or initially paused reviews during COVID. And one administrator said that in-person reviews were really important to them because it allowed verification of equipment purchases and interact with program staff. So next slide. So as we all know, apprenticeship includes related technical instruction and on-the-job learning. When the pandemic hit back in 2020, which is hard to believe, that was 6 years ago now, state administrators said that many of their training partners faced logistical challenges transitioning in-person training online. But several administrators noted that online training did provide apprentices with greater flexibility than in-person training. Despite the challenges some smaller training providers face building their online systems for the first time, administrators praised training partners for adapting quickly. In particular, they said that larger programs and college-based programs more easily adapted training online. So, as might be expected, online and asynchronous learning gave some apprentices more flexibility, especially apprentices with families and apprentices living in rural areas who may face transportation barriers or long travel times to training centers. As one state administrator said, the apprentices love online learning because they can go home, turn on their computer, be on time, get washed up and into their sweats, feel casual, and really absorb. They're passing their exams with flying colors. Still, though, some apprentices did face challenges accessing online training, including limited internet connectivity or complex material that was hard to learn virtually. So while online and asynchronous training can expand access for apprentices, there may be still limitations to online learning. Next slide. So another key finding in our brief is that while online learning may not be a substitute for in-person hands-on learning in all industries, it may offer opportunities to expand into industries. I think this is really interesting as we think of continuing to expand apprenticeship into what we're calling non-traditional industries. So most administrators said that some occupations still need in-person hands-on training, especially in industries like welding, construction, and the building trades. At the same time, though, some administrators said remote learning created opportunities in industries where online instruction quote, makes sense. So one example here is a management apprenticeship program with a credit union. The related instruction could happen online in the evening at the apprentice's own pace, while the on-the-job learning happened on-site during the day. So the key lesson here is that the mode of training should be intentional depending on the industry and occupation. Next slide. We also reviewed Rapid's data for our brief, and we saw that there were no mass cancellations of apprenticeships during the pandemic, which was great to see. Nationally, the number of active apprentices was steady between 2019 and 2020, and it did increase in 2021 and 2022. However, we did see some disruption in the number of new apprentices. So these are apprentices who are entering apprenticeship programs. There was a decline in the number of new apprentices by about 17% from 2019 to 2020, indicating that there was less hiring and or less interest among prospective apprentices. By 2020, the number of active apprentices slightly exceeded 2019 levels, so it did bounce back. The takeaway here is that the pandemic slowed new starts more than it caused mass program cancellations. And then moving on to the next slide, what we heard from state administrators in our focus groups really mirrored what we saw in the data. They said that some employers were reluctant to hire new apprentices during a time of economic uncertainty, and states experienced less participant interest. There were two main reasons for the slowdown. First, some employers were cautious. While administrators said they did not observe large-scale cancellations, they did say that some employers were reluctant to hire new apprentices or backfill openings. So when an apprentice completed their apprenticeship, they might not have opened a new spot for a new apprentice. There were exceptions, of course. Maryland and Arkansas did describe growth in construction apprenticeships specifically during the pandemic. And then the second point here is that participant interest fell in some places. Board administrators described less interest from prospective apprentices, citing higher wages in other jobs, signing bonuses, and long-term commitment of apprenticeship programs as potential barriers. One state administrator captured this challenge nicely with the quote on the slide, which I'll read now. The wage progression is one of the biggest issues when across the street from our two-year colleges, there's a signing bonus to work at a fast food restaurant for $2,000 to $3,000, and their wages are higher than apprenticeship program wages. How do you compete with that? Okay, next slide. So just moving along as we move to wrap up this presentation, um, we also looked at how the COVID pandemic affected industry interests. And we saw that even while some employers slowed hiring, the pandemic did accelerate expansion into non-traditional industries to address workforce shortages and meet employer demand. Several administrators described starting or expanding healthcare apprenticeship programs, so similar to what was happening in the UK, and teaching apprenticeship programs to respond to workforce shortages in those industries. We also saw this industry expansion in the Rapids apprenticeship data. From 2019 to 2022, active registered apprentices increased by 42% in education services and by 70% in healthcare and social assistance. Next slide. So just to close, the memo has a few lasting lessons in summary, and I'm excited to move to our panel discussion to see where things are now. But the takeaways here are that technology definitely helped agencies, like it helped many of us keep working during a time of disruption, and it often allowed staff to expand their reach and convene partners in ways that they were not able to do before when those interactions were only in person. Online training also increased flexibility for some apprentices, but there were some challenges that some apprentices had with the online training. And it's important to note that not every occupation is well suited to move online, that hands-on learning is still very important in particular industries and occupations. And then healthcare and education became more important growth industries for apprenticeships specifically during that time of the pandemic. Post-pandemic, we did hear that administrators had plans to continue some of their hybrid work and training with hands-on learning kept in person where needed. So, with that, I think we can move to our panel discussion. I'm really excited to chat with our panelists today. As I mentioned, all of their states participated in those virtual discussions for the brief that I just shared. Our conversation today will kind of pick off where we left off from the brief to hear how things are going post-pandemic and what innovations have stuck. So, with that, um, I'd love to start with Jeremy from Minnesota. If you could please briefly introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your professional experience during the pandemic. What was it like? What did you have to change straight away? What were some of those challenges that you dealt with? Just to kick off our discussion today. That would be great.
Appreciate it. So my name is Jeremy Parker. I'm with the Apprenticeship Minnesota, the Registered Apprenticeship Unit at the Minnesota Department of Labor and Industry. Uh, Been in this role for 8 years now. And as Harry mentioned, I've worked kind of in all facets of the construction industry. In my role here at the state, and I'm a building and construction trades apprenticeship expert, working primarily with the building and construction trades, and I also handled our utility industry in the state during the COVID period as well. I think kind of like everyone, it kind of came, and all of a sudden it was like, I guess we're going to go and work from home and kind of figure out things as we go. So I mean, it was a very fluid situation. Uh, we kind of went out and we went from being a very hands-on, uh, in-person in-person relationship unit to now all of a sudden we need to transfer to this new world we're going to live in. Working from home was a new thing for most of us, and then just learning how to deal with things that we find to be very commonplace now. Using Teams and Zoom, and really just kind of working through all of that as to how are we going to continue to provide the level of service that we provided to our sponsors, apprentices, and other stakeholders across the state. Um, that became the real big challenge. I mean, we also in Minnesota, our apprenticeship statute requires us to do compliance reviews on every program's yearly. And at the time, we had about 150 programs throughout the state. So how are we going to continue to do that to ensure that not only we're doing what's required of our jobs as outlined in our state statute, but also holding our programs accountable for that. So it was really just kind of coming up with ideas of how are we going to do this? How are we going to implement a lot of these new technologies? And how are we going to keep folks in compliance to ensure that the promises that were made to apprentices, OJL hours, RTI, those promises became promises kept to everybody as well. So it was just kind of a lot of just learning on the fly. And, I'm kind of interested to hear what other folks have to say. But, like one of the biggest things, though, was figuring out how our programs were going to continue to provide their related technical instruction, especially with our building trade programs, where so much of it is in-person, hands-on training. So one of the very first things that we did within that first 2 weeks was to ask all of our programs to submit a plan to us as to how they were going to continue to provide that training. And some of the outcomes that came out of that, and again, they were also in a very fluid situation as well. So we had to ensure that they had time to adjust to what worked, what didn't work as well. But some really great things came out of that. I know we'll get to that a little bit further down the line. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Ryan.
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy. I think so many of us are now used to Teams and Zoom, but that certainly wasn't the norm for everyone 6 years ago. So appreciate kind of that look back in time. Tanya, Mississippi, would love to pass it to you. Same question.
All right, thanks, Ryan. And I also want to thank you for inviting me to be a part of the discussion today. And we were very excited at that time to be a part of the research that you all were doing. But again, my name is Tonya Neely. I'm the director of the Office of Apprenticeship at the Mississippi Department of Employment Security. And that is the workforce agency in the state of Mississippi. Inside of that office sits the Mississippi Apprenticeship Program, which is the program that is given permission by the governor to seek registered apprenticeship funds for creation and expansion in Mississippi. So we are an OA state. So we have a federal office that controls the registration. And the Mississippi Apprenticeship Program sits in the Workforce Agency, and we support that office by doing business engagement and helping these businesses in Mississippi create these training programs. So what we had to change quickly when COVID hit, I had only been in this position about 6 months. I was new to workforce and I was new to registered apprenticeship. And we, out of the states that were a part of this study, we were, I would say, the smaller state. We had the least amount of registered apprenticeship programs. I think there were about 68 programs in the state at that time. And not every one of those programs were affiliated with the Mississippi Apprenticeship Program because we're grant funded. We count programs and apprentices that are attached to the grant funds. And so for us, I think the biggest change was just more what Jeremy and what you were saying, Ryan, more use of the online system for communicating. So we did have technical assistance through the Department of Labor and the TA providers. So we would meet once a month online, Zoom. But we had more of that. So we sat at the state level. We were at the community college board at that time. And so we used our community colleges, workforce areas to push out registered apprenticeships. So versus going to the community colleges, having meetings and seeing what was going on, we did a lot of online meetings. And so it seems strange now, like I was saying, because it's second nature. Like this morning, we're on this online meeting, but we increased that. So we had to change quickly with the way we communicated with our subgrantees, the community colleges, to find out what was happening with the businesses and the apprentices and how we could support it. So I think the biggest challenge for us, we had a young team. We were all novices to registered apprenticeship. And then we sat at a level at the state level. We didn't work directly with the business and industry other than helping them create the programs. So we had to work through the community college, contact people to get the information extracted. You know, what do we need to do? How can we support you all as liaisons for expanding registered apprenticeship in the state? And what do the companies need? So we had to change quickly with how we communicated and just address the issue of being able to use the platforms of Zoom and Teams to communicate.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Tonya. And not an easy task. First year, a couple months into the job. Appreciate you sharing that. Adele, I'll pass it to you, and then we can move on to our next question.
Yeah, hello everyone. So I am the chief at California's Division of Apprenticeship Standards, and I actually joined DAS as the deputy chief in 2021. So I just to full transparency, I joined sort of after everything had shifted, and which feels like a really long time ago now. Um, but I feel like there's certainly a lot of things that we have learned and that continue to be kind of legacies of that period of time. Um, I will say that DAS was a fairly tech forward agency within government, and therefore, like a lot of the sort of base systems of registration and all of these different things were already online. So I think that there was a level of ease to that in terms of the transition. Um, I personally, earlier in my career, like sort of before, was working as Harry introduced me. Like I worked with the community colleges before being in this role, and I think COVID was a really fantastic forcing function to shift to more online instruction and just sort of more comfort with that online instruction, which I know we're going to talk about more, but I think that that was incredibly positive for apprentices because obviously apprentices are working and taking classes and still trying to raise their families or, you know, do all the other things that life demands. And so I think having the flexibility of online learning shift has been really fantastic for apprenticeship. What I will say like was a challenge that our team, the DAS team, felt during COVID was that I know like evaluations had been done more in person and had to shift online. But I think also online OJT is really hard. I think like for junior talent in general, which is, often the case, usually the case with apprentices, it's hard to get really good mentoring when you're in a virtual environment. And so I think that part was more of like the negative cost upon the apprenticeship system that we felt. But we certainly had a lot of interactions with the programs, and certainly on our building and construction trades side, there was a real, history of in-person meetings that had to shift to online that I think it was hard. It's hard to do an apprentice discipline when you're online, when it's a Zoom, right? Like you kind of want to look in somebody's eyes and like feel their energy and feel their like where are they at and coach them and support them through whatever is a challenge for them in that apprenticeship program. So I think some of that was really hard and has shifted back to being in person. So I think a lot of like the sort of tech and systems and online learning shifts were really good and have stayed. But the OJT and I think a lot of that like coaching and mentoring of the apprentices has rightfully shifted more back to being in person, which I think is good. So that's just a few high level thoughts. I know we'll dive into some more of those more fully.
Yeah, thank you so much, Adele. Appreciate that. Certainly lots of challenges. I think moving on to this next question, would really like to hear about what are you all doing now? So either from your agents, or you could do both. From your agency perspective, what are some of the operations or practices that you have kept post-pandemic? So those might be admin efficiencies, continuing with virtual supports to employers or partners, things related to your program reviews. Are you still doing some of those virtually? So thinking about your agency operations, what are some things that have stick? Maybe in a way that is allowing you to grow and scale apprenticeship, which is something that I know is top of mind for all of us in the apprenticeship space as we're trying to get to 1 million apprentices. So, what has stuck at an agency operations level? And then, if you also want to talk about following up on what you're saying, Adele, about the RTI, the OJT, some of this training happening online. Are you seeing this happen in certain industries where some of that training is staying online? I know you mentioned, Adele, going back in person, but that might vary by industry or occupation. So both from an agency perspective, what you're doing that is stuck, and then also at the training level. So whoever wants to jump in with that one, would love to hear from all of you.
I'll start. Since we are an OA state, there are certain aspects of the process of registered apprenticeship that we don't do. We leave that to the OA office. So I think the biggest thing, which will probably be seconded by Jeremy and Adele, is the online meetings. That has been very convenient because it allows you to meet with people and not have to travel 3 hours or whatever the case may be. We can reach more people because we can invite them to an online presentation or meeting. So that has been very beneficial to us in the state of Mississippi, which is probably beneficial to everybody that does a registered apprenticeship or works in any industry, honestly. So the online meetings have stayed. And I like to do the online meetings in the beginning. Let's see if registered apprenticeship is for you. Let's talk about the pros and cons. And then if you're really serious about it and you want to know more, we can send an apprenticeship expansion specialist out or an ATR out for a face-to-face now. So that has stayed with us. So the virtual support, we do a lot of training online, just as DOL does, training with us, technical assistance training with us. So we pass that along as well. And as far as reviews, in Mississippi, we don't do the reviews because we sit at the state level. The Federal Office of Apprenticeship does the reviews. So we didn't have to have that aspect of it. But I do know that some of those reviews had been done online. And I think it made it more convenient for that office as well to not have to travel and incur expense and time to meet with employers about their programs. But then there's another, the flip side, like Adele said, if you have an issue you think you really would like to be face to face, that can be a hindrance. But I'm pretty sure that that office still does face to face visits for reviews. We just don't handle reviews in our office.
Yeah, I'm happy to kind of build off that. So we have two sort of statutorily established committees over apprenticeship. So we have the California Apprenticeship Council and the Interagency Advisory Committee on Apprenticeship. And the CAC really oversees all of our building and fire trades programs, and IACA is like all the other industries. So these are groups that meet quarterly and sometimes are rulemaking, sometimes are advising, but so Mississippi is a big state. California is even larger from a geographic perspective. And so getting everybody to convene quarterly, not only is it a lot of cost, but some people just won't take the time to travel, right? So when it's in person only, which it was before, some people just wouldn't come. And so obviously COVID, all of that shifted entirely online. And I think what has happened in the sort of wake afterwards is that the CAC, which is more the building trades folks, have shifted back to being in person. They like to convene, and sometimes they're grappling again with tricky topics. And so I think they appreciate being able to be in person, but it's hybrid, which I think is really fantastic because sometimes somebody can't travel, but they can now participate. And before they just wouldn't participate if they couldn't travel. Whereas IACA, which is a much broader set of industries and stakeholders, they have stayed, we have hybrid for both groups, but the IACA community has opted to be more virtual participation, which is fine and actually allows us, just like Tonya was saying, to like engage with more employers, engage with more folks that we wouldn't be able to engage with otherwise because they just wouldn't take the time to travel. So I think that like those councils and advisory bodies, it's really, really helpful because all those people are they're volunteering their time to advise us as the state on how to expand apprenticeship, right? Or how to run the apprenticeship system. And so having that hybrid option is hugely impactful from like just an engagement perspective. So that's definitely something that we have kept post-pandemic that I think has significantly strengthened our system.
Amazing. Love those examples too. That really brings it to life. Appreciate that, Adele. Jeremy, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, we're the same situation, especially with our outreach engagement, as Adele mentioned, and we have a quarterly advisory board as well. And we've moved a lot of any events that we hold in person at our primary office in the Twin Cities, where we've now made that ability to be kind of a hybrid so that folks can call in from outstate, from outstate regions or rural regions of the state. So I don't need to beat on that anymore. I can maybe speak a little bit more on like compliance and engagement with programs. Moving to, we moved into doing like virtual reviews. Now that things have switched, I mean, we still have that availability to do a Teams review. Myself, I tend to do a lot more on-site, in-person reviews, but where the implementation of some of the technology that existed, it used to be if I go out to a review, I might spend 5, 6, 7 hours going through files and then maybe have, 30 minutes to an hour to spend with the program talking about, any technical assistance or whatever questions they might have. Now for any file reviews and documentation reviews, we just work that through a Dropbox or a OneDrive system where I can get all of this documentation ahead of time, go through it at my desk, whether that's at my home office or our primary office, so that then when I get out to do the actual on-site piece of that review, we can really then start digging into any of that technical assistance. We moved over to the Rapid system kind of during that COVID period as well. So it was a lot of doing, training on getting folks up to speed with Rapids, or, are there any, is there anything we can work with in your outreach and engagement to help attract applicants to your program? You know, is there, just in picking up some of those best practices so that it didn't feel like it was this big rushed, I'm just going to sit and go through files and then say hello, goodbye, and out the door. So where now I can go out there and really sit down and answer those questions from everyone that's involved with that program, from training directors down to admin staff, instructors, and even when I'm out there, if I can grab a couple of apprentices now and just kind of say, hey, how's it going? What do you like? What do you not like? Uh, so it really made kind of the review process not this like real invasive feeling system that we're coming in and just digging through everything. And I'm going to give you a report a couple of weeks later where now it's kind of like we can come in and build those relationships and help improve programs and help improve the experience of the apprentices. So that's been like, on my end of things, that's been a really great development that kind of came out of this.
That's great, Jeremy. And given all the partners that are involved in running these programs, it sounds like that's a very beneficial use of your time to be able to build those relationships, like you said, and troubleshoot, answer questions. So love how everyone's using technology, continuing to use technology, but there's a time and a place for that. And, the in-person interactions are still necessary, of course. If we could just spend a few minutes touching on online training. So we have the RTI with OJT. Jeremy, you mentioned how do you do RTI in construction, and Adele, OJT, you mentioned the importance of that being in person. If anyone wants to share, what are you seeing in your state or there are certain industries or occupation where you're seeing some of the training happening online and that's working well? Is everything back in person, from the apprentice experience perspective, knowing that, there are some benefits that they might see with that online training as well as challenges?
Sure, I'm happy to kick us off. I will say, as I said earlier, I think this is probably like the most positive and meaningful part of the legacy of COVID is the ability to shift a lot of training online. And I think also when we think about, equitable expansion of apprenticeship, having options for online learning makes a big difference. Like if you're in rural areas, if you have accessibility challenges, any of that, like those online learning options make a big, big impact to one's ability to even participate in the apprenticeship program in the first place. So I think that that's absolutely a really positive thing. I will also say, how we have expanded apprenticeships in California is definitely very in collaboration with our public education system. And I think that there were some holdouts in that world, and particularly like, in community college contexts. Like, I think it's really amazing when we can have apprenticeship programs that where the RSI, sorry, we call it RSI, RTI, where the RTI is a community college course, right? Where they're getting college credit for that RTI instruction. It's so cool when that can happen. It doesn't always, but sometimes we make the stars align to make that happen. And when those courses are then online, which they absolutely have shifted to significantly more online thanks to the pandemic, it makes those courses more accessible in the context of an apprenticeship, which I think is, again, hugely meaningful. I do think that there were some very interesting and creative attempts during the pandemic and sort of a little bit in its aftermath around trying to do a whole bunch of like augmented reality, virtual reality trainings. I remember seeing one that was really cool that did this whole, it was like a building inspector, and it did like a whole walkthrough of the building in VR. And then they were like, and you can switch this to like 6 different languages. And I was like, oh, wow, that's really cool, right? We got a lot of different languages spoken in our state, in our country, and to be able to just like switch that training to another language to help people who might be English language learners. I thought that was really cool. I don't know, to be honest, I don't know how much of that has stayed because in many ways, I do think in the building trades in particular, they've pretty solidly shifted back to in-person training. And I do think that makes sense. Like some learning needs to just be done with your hands, and even really cool augmented reality is going to give you like a tour, but it's not really going to give you that like tactile experience. So I think there's definitely some obvious adoptions where more of the like tech and business services and accounting and some of these different areas have shifted to a lot of online learning, whereas like advanced manufacturing and construction and healthcare, like that's more in-person type, RTI. But yeah, those are just a few of the anecdotes that I've encountered.
I'll add on to that, Adele. That sounds so familiar to me. I can remember touring a nonprofit that was interested in partnering with the Mississippi Apprenticeship Program for registered apprenticeship, and they had the VR, and we had the headsets on, and I was a construction person for about 15 minutes. I thought, how in the world would anybody really learn how to do this? But it was, I thought it would be great for exposure, for exposing young folks to the different industries. And what I will say to that question, Ryan, is in Mississippi, what I've seen more programs are more interested in the related technical instruction being online. Actually, you mentioned in one of your slides and was when in this 2023 study, Keesler Federal Credit Union in Mississippi wanted to do a registered apprenticeship program for their branch managers. They had managers, so they were incumbent workers already there working, doing the banking type job each day. They created a registered apprenticeship program, and the related technical instruction was all online. So they could do it asynchronous. They could work all day and get the OJT, and then in the evenings they would do the RTI. And I have seen more, I think from that, I've seen more companies more interested in doing some of the RTI online versus the OJT. That's what I'll say for Mississippi.
Yeah, and I mean, and here, and again, like you mentioned earlier, I work really closely with our building trade programs. And the one thing kind of a lot of them over COVID was moving a lot of their classes that they could to a team Zoom virtual setting, when they're doing electrical theory or, some OSHA classes or whatever it is, things that doesn't necessarily need to be hands-on, where they moved to doing a lot of that type of coursework in a Zoom setting. And then bringing in smaller groups, depending on different states, had different restrictions as to like how many people can be in a place and how much spacing and things like that. So then they could bring folks in on an intermittent basis to do some of those hands-on learning in smaller groups, which, anytime you can do things in a little bit smaller group, people tend to get a little bit more out of it. But as we transition out, kind of, when we start looking at like some legacy things out of that is, a lot of the programs that I work with and, in the state, they've retained that ability to move some of those classes into those virtual settings. And it's worked out great, especially for when we have statewide programs that are mainly headquartered out of the Twin Cities metro area, and they have apprentices working all the way up near the Canadian border. It was really tough for them to come down for in-person classes. So a few of our statewide programs have begun, they're still using a lot of the virtual instruction piece, so those apprentices can just come from the job site, go to their house, go to the hotel if they're working out on the road, get the instruction in that setting. And then a few of those programs have created like mobile labs where they have a lot of the hands-on equipment that they would need. So then they can go to these other kind of city hub areas throughout the state and be like, hey, we're going to be here these days. We'll have our mobile lab, so then they can come in and do some of that hands-on training. And that's been retained for some of our statewide programs because they've just found it to be so beneficial. Apprentices are having to take a week or two off from school to come down to the Twin Cities. And then two, I mean, we're also referred to as Minnesota. So in our winter months in that, when we have inclimatic weather where it's just hard to travel through, the programs can then just say, hey, everyone, we're going to call an audible here on what we're covering for this week or for this night. We're going to move to an in-person class setting. So we don't have to worry about people being on the road and taking those risks. And that also kind of bore out too over the months of December, January, and February here, especially in the Twin Cities metro area when we had the metro surge operations going on, where they were able to kind of create hybrid settings for some apprentices who may not have wanted to be out and about, moving around during those operations, where they could instead of missing class, they were able to zoom in and stay on top of their classes. So it was kind of a new thing for everybody, but it's been really nice to see and very interesting to see like some of that has been retained, especially in the construction industry. That they're able to be fluid depending on whatever the situation is, so that they can continue to ensure that instruction is delivered as it needs to be.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you. Really appreciate those examples. I think it really drives home how programs are using the online training for the RTI, maybe not so much for OJT, but for the RTI. And even though some of the training providers may have faced initial challenges getting their training programs online, it sounds like a lot of that has stuck. So, it was worth that investment to get those programs online, which is great to hear. I'm just going to turn to maybe get one more question before opening it up for discussion. But there's a lot more I can certainly ask. I just wanted to briefly touch on this. And whoever would like to answer this, please feel free to. But the brief highlighted some of the disruptions, the economic disruptions that we saw during the pandemic. And we're now seeing AI, artificial intelligence, as a similar disruptor, with discussions of economic and job market impacts. So companies are reporting layoffs because of AI. We're also seeing AI potentially affecting hiring for entry-level positions. So really curious, how are your states thinking about this, if you are, about apprenticeship as an opportunity to retrain, reskill workers, career switchers who've been laid off, or as a workforce development strategy for young people who are entering the job market, and maybe now there's more increased competition for those entry level roles.
Yeah, I will say I think about this a lot. And I think, one of the things that was in your brief was also, during the pandemic, there was a real increase in both healthcare and education apprenticeships. And I think that part of that, workforce shortages, recognizing that was I feel like it was a real broader cultural moment where we all understood, where we had to categorize jobs as essential and not essential. And we, as a society, were like, oh, actually, like our care economy, right? I sort of use that broad term of care economy to include all of education and all of healthcare. Like that care economy is really, really important to us. And we need to be doing more to develop this workforce. And, it is, there's a lot of pathways in the care economy that expect people to work for free while they're in training in a way that we don't in other parts of our economy. And so we have definitely, over the past few years, seen a significant increase in education and healthcare apprenticeships more broadly. And I think certainly in this era of AI, like the workforce briefings that I get to go to in the state of California really show that right now, in terms of employment growth is continuing in healthcare and in education. Employment is contracting in tech, right? Like there's all these, we're here in the heart of a lot of these AI companies, and you'd think, oh, these companies are booming, so there's lots of employment. No, there's not. Like that is not where people are working. Or that's not where jobs are growing. And so I do think that we're all spending a lot of time probably looking at where jobs are growing and where we're going to be needing the workforce, right? Because as we develop apprenticeship programs, we want to be peering into the future as much as we can to say which companies will be hiring people and where will there be talent needs, and therefore let's build these earn and learn pathways into those sectors. And I really see that partly due to COVID, but partly due to AI in this moment. Like education and healthcare will be augmented by AI, but they will not be replaced. Like we will not be replacing a nurse or a teacher or a doctor with AI. They will use AI tools to hopefully level up whatever their area of work is, but those jobs are going to continue to exist and continue to be really valuable in society. So I think there's a lot as a broader society we need to do to actually value our care economy and those who work in our care economy. But I feel like what we can do in our little corner of apprenticeship world in that bigger puzzle is to really be intentionally building pathways that are full, debt-free earn and learn pathways to become a teacher, to become a nurse, to become, all the different allied healthcare and education and early care and education, so that we're creating that earn and learn pathway. So that's certainly a big strategic focus for us.
Great. Well, thank you. Tani, did you want to say something quickly?
No, I was just going to say that I
Yeah.
know there's interest in AI in registered
Mm.
apprenticeship. We just recently had a company contact us. One of our ATRs was working with our Office of Apprenticeship to try to work on standards and how to do that. And we know we have these executive orders that have come out from this administration on AI. I just wanted to mention that we do have a presence in our state. We have a new organization, the Mississippi Artificial Intelligence Network, that's kind of leading the way for the state of Mississippi for education, workforce, and innovation in AI in the state. So there should be more coming. We haven't signed a registered apprenticeship program with AI, but I see it coming.
Wonderful. That's exciting. That's the first time I'm hearing about that. So thank you so much for sharing. I just want to pass it to Harry quickly to see if we had any questions in the chat or from the audience. If you haven't put a question, you can now, to take some audience questions before we close.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ryan. I'm gonna open this up. Anyone in the audience who'd like to come in, please do either put your hand up. I think I saw one come up earlier, so please come in or put your question in the chat. Just while we're waiting, I just want to second what Adele was saying on education and healthcare. We did some work late last year looking at growth opportunities in apprenticeship, and when we looked at the occupations where we thought apprenticeship is likely to grow, I think we identified five kind of industries, but education and healthcare are the ones where we were 100% confident. Whatever happens to the labor market with AI, there is going to be huge demand for apprenticeship. Our issue in education, and particularly early years, is we don't necessarily like that wages don't necessarily follow the market demand there. So there's some quite tricky policy questions. They're a little bit outside of the scope of apprenticeship, but that's a tricky one.
I would also add, Tonya, I appreciate what you're talking, you're seeing programs emerge. I think what we're seeing a lot with programs is not so much like an AI apprenticeship, but that AI literacy skills are being more and more incorporated into the training for a lot of jobs. I heard somebody say the other day, like, AI isn't going to take your job, but the person who knows how to use AI tools is going to take your job. And so I that's a lot how I'm trying to frame the conversation from like the broader apprenticeship perspective, because I think, we do need to make sure that in workforce development and education, we are intentionally upskilling people to use these tools that are emerging. Because so I think that's been a sort of a focus area of conversation. And I think there was some AI competency frameworks that came out, but anyhow, so that's a little bit of what we're looking at.
We've got a question from Samina in the sidebar, and we've probably got time for one more after that, so please keep them coming. So people talk about the effect of the pandemic on the younger generation in terms of mental health, attachment to their workforce. Do you see lasting impact of that within the apprenticeship systems in your state as well? So do you see that, the effect we had in K-12 and in college for that generation, where everything suddenly moved online? saw a lot of a big mental health impact. Do you see that in that generation of apprenticeship learners? It's a really
I
good
mean,
question.
I think that's just an all-encompassing thing across all workers in the workforce. You know, the importance and kind of how we're now shining a bigger light on mental health and substance abuse and whatever else. And I know with a lot of the programs that I've worked with in our unit at Apprenticeship Minnesota here, we've put a big focus on implementing, you know, mental health awareness into their apprenticeship programs. I mean, a lot of the programs that I work with now mandate as part of their either orientation or just their related technical instruction, uh, you know, mental health awareness training, and then just the added supports that are around, you know, throughout the employers or unions or the apprenticeship programs. Has been something that I've been very excited to see, and that it's not being done as just kind of a passing thing, like, oh, this is what we need to do, but it's something that's being very much taken to heart, which I think is a great thing.
Yeah, I would echo that. That it's been a real shift that I've seen in the past few years, and particularly in our construction apprenticeship programs, that there's like more and more of those programs have mental and behavioral health components in how they are supporting and training their apprentices, which I think is phenomenal. We've also seen a real emergence of mental and behavioral health apprenticeships. There were a few that were in the state before the pandemic, and we've seen a lot more emerge in recent years. So there's also been a lot of like state investments into mental and behavioral health, like in our school systems. But you got to train and develop the workforce to be able to offer those supports. So that's been an area of program development as well.
So it's a real positive there that it's shone a light on the need. Tondalea, do you want to come in
Yes,
with a question?
I was just gonna add, our apprenticeship was working with nurses transitioning into practice, and we actually built in a resiliency and wellness component because of the mental health crisis that we saw within our, I mean, especially during COVID, it was, I mean, everybody, you know, I think initially at the start of COVID, it was like 1 in 4 people were, you know, experiencing some type of mental health issue. But as we moved into it, it was like 3 out of 4. And so we really started to see that in our new grad nurses. And so what we did is we actually created a resiliency and a wellness program as part of their training. And all of that we actually did online. So we did it by cohorts. So we did, when you were saying, hey, about the online piece, yeah, we started online because it was during COVID for that piece of it. And then, of course, on the job training happened within their clinical setting. But then everything, we've kept it online ever since. And I can't imagine us doing it differently because we're doing it all across Colorado and rural parts of the state. So, so it's something I don't think if we're properly training the workforce, we have to be thinking about their wellness, because if they're front facing in anything, it's really hard. Physically, spiritually, emotionally, mentally, all of the things. So if we're really wanting to keep them in the workforce, we have to address that. So that's kind of what we did. Thank you for the conversation, everyone. I really appreciate it.
Completely agree. Thanks, Tondalea. I'm afraid we're at time and we need to let our panel get back to their day jobs. So I'm going to bear for giving us their time. And we have another webinar coming up next week on Tuesday. That's on setting up universities. So please dial in for that. But yeah, thank you very much for our panel. Thanks for joining. Really interesting and worthwhile topic. Thanks very much, everyone. Have a great week.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Great to be with you today.
Thanks, Paul.
Appreciate it.
Bye.